sell out or not to sell out? That is the question. Well, okay, that's not actually the question that we want to answer. The question we want to answer is, are you selling out or are you not selling out? And I'm going to try to answer that question by way of a really exciting announcement that I have to make. But first, let me try to explain to you what selling out is. Now, I'm sure that everybody watching knows what selling out is, but I'm going to relate it to something that's very near and dear to my generation's heart. Back in the 80s, U2 was this incredible revelation of a band. They were incredibly politically charged, and they had an important message for everyone. And they created songs that spoke to us and taught us some very important lessons. And then, in the late 80s and early 90s, it seemed as though U2 kind of dropped their political message. And they started writing songs and producing albums for the sole purpose of selling them. It was all about commercial success instead of a political message. Now, that was fine. And even after that sort of delineation between the original U2 and the new U2, they still created some incredible music. But for the most part, people in my generation started looking at the band as if they sold out. They gave up what brought them where they were. They gave up the thing that made them who they were in lieu of a commercial hit. Which was kind of ironic because the original fans started to give up on them. Now, of course, things always come full circle, and most of us have gone back to going, oh, U2, they're still U2. And here's the thing. A lot of bands can seem like they're selling out. But in truth, some of those bands are simply evolving. My favorite band of all time is Rush. And if you look back at Rush's early history, their early albums, they are not the same as the albums they released later in their career. I happen to be a bigger fan of 80s and 90s Rush than I am of early Rush and later right now. I still like the later stuff. But even Rush fans started questioning whether or not in that 80s period that because they started using more keyboards and things like that, that they were selling out, that they were just hopping on to the coattails of new wave music to create something that they weren't. Now, here's where all of this comes from. Earlier this week, a friend and I, were having a conversation. Now, this friend also happens to be a writer. Now, interestingly enough, that friend and I have taken very, very similar paths in our writing careers. We didn't get there the same way, but once we got there, our paths kind of paralleled each other. And we wrote a lot of horror early on. In fact, we both wrote a lot of zombie novels. But eventually we started kind of migrating away from the zombie fiction. There's a reason for that. Zombie fiction, when I first started writing zombie fiction, it was different. And it wasn't nearly as popular. And then The Walking Dead happened. And when that happened, there was an massive influx of new writers writing zombie fiction. Because why? Because they saw the writing on the wall that zombie fiction was taking off. And they wanted to be a part of that gravy train. So they all came in and they started writing zombie fiction. And eventually we hit the point of supersaturation where there were too many writers writing zombie fiction and not enough readers reading zombie fiction. And that's how it lasted for a long time. Now it starting to wane a little bit, but even though there are fewer writers of zombie fiction, there are still tons and tons and tons of books. So at some point, it became really hard to be seen as a writer of zombie fiction. Early on in my career as a writer of zombie fiction, I could be seen pretty easily. You go to Amazon, and type in zombie fiction and my books would come up. Now, because there are millions of zombie books out there, you type my name in zombie fiction or type zombie fiction and my name doesn't always come up. So both myself and this other author had made a conscious decision to kind of walk away from zombie fiction. And in fact, and we both had this discussion this week with each other, not with you. I'm having it with you now. We had the discussion about how, and this is very sad, relatively speaking, that horror doesn't sell. It just doesn't sell. No matter how much we love the genre, it's becoming, unless you're Stephen King, it's becoming almost impossible to make a living as a horror writer. That's sad, because at one point it was possible to make a living as a horror writer. And the truth of the matter is, and this is one of those things that not a lot of people want to talk about, is that there are only a few genres now wherein an author can actually make a good living with. One of them, obviously, is romance. Romance has always been, is now, and will always be incredibly popular. In fact, it consumes like 70% of the market share of fiction. That's huge. And that's great for romance authors. I'm not a romance writer. I do add romance to my books, but I'm not a romance author per se. Another genre that has been, is, and will be always popular, and this is what brings me to this discussion with you, is crime thrillers and crime fiction. Now, here's the announcement part of our little discussion, Muse. After my little conversation with, it wasn't little, I sound like I'm belittling this conversation. It was a really important conversation. After this conversation I had with this friend of mine, I decided that I was going to return to crime thrillers. Now, although you might know me as a zombie author or the author of the Fear series or the Reaper series or whatever series you might know me as, I started out writing crime thrillers. In fact, my very first book I ever wrote, A Blade Away, is a crime thriller. It's a part of the Fringe Killer series. Now, I didn't make this decision lightly. And I didn't make this decision as a sellout. Yes, I am perfectly aware that of all the genres that I write in, the most popular is crime thrillers. And yet I haven't written in that genre in over 10 years. Because I had a lot of other things to say. Because I wrote A Blade Away, I wrote Gothica, Endgame, and Control. Those are the 4 books in the Fringe Killer series right now. I wrote those books, and then I had to take a break. Because I wanted to write other things. I got into writing to write horror. But I didn't write horror originally because I wanted to make sure that I had the skills to actually honor the genre in a way that I felt comfortable with. So once I didn't really use, but I worked within the crime thriller series because that was the first book I came up with. And eventually, once I got the skills that I felt necessary, I started writing horror. That first book in the genre was I, Zombie I, which was the book that kind of made me known as an author. But here's the thing. A Blade Away was a very, very special book for me, not only because it was the first book I ever wrote, but because I wrote that book in homage to a friend of mine who was a member of the transgendered community in the city in which I live. And I wanted to honor him. And I wrote that book 20 years ago, as I said. And I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that I had to tell this story. So I wrote this book, and then I set it aside for a long time. I didn't do anything with it. And eventually it got published. And I really enjoyed writing that book, and I really loved the characters. Now, here's the thing. Now, you know, I'm very transparent about this, and I'm also not one to pat myself on the back. However, I'm going to say this. The Fringe Killer series that I started writing 20 years ago was ahead of its time. And I'll tell you why. The main character of the Fringe Killer series is a female detective. Back then, that wasn't very common. Even more uncommon was the fact that she had a gay male partner. So I had a book series with a female lead and a gay male secondary lead. And it was set in Louisville, Kentucky. And it was also about a female in a male-dominated world. And it was about a homophobic world. Things have changed. Now, female detectives and gay detectives are not uncommon. In fact, I know female and I know gay detectives and police officers. So, it just dawned on me this week that it is now a perfect storm for this series. The world accepts the idea of the female detective and the gay male detective, or the gay female detective. It's just accepted. Back then, I had to work a little harder to make it believable, to make it real, and to make it something that people would be willing to read. And back then, the character of Skip, who was the gay male detective, had to be kind of flamboyant at times, because I've always been an ally of the LGBTQ community. Always. I have many friends. My stepson is gay. I fully embrace the community. I am an ally, and I am very proud of that. And I know now that I can write the Fringe Killer series in such a way where it doesn't necessarily have to celebrate those communities in the same way it did early on. It's just like Schitt's Creek, which is, I think, one of the most perfect sitcoms to have ever been aired. And one of the things that made Schitt's Creek so beautiful was the fact that it had gay characters in it, and it didn't make an issue of it. They just were. And that was wonderful. And I can now write this series with that same idea in mind. Skip Abrams can just be gay. He could just be himself. He doesn't have to prove anything anymore. And Jamie Davenport, the lead character, she still has to prove herself, because even now, women still have to work harder than men to get the same recognition. So there will be that aspect of this series. That's not going to go away. But it doesn't have to beat the reader over the head as like it did early on. So when I realized that now was such a perfect storm for this series, it made absolute sense for me to go back to it. It's almost like I had to step away from it because I needed the audience I needed to give the audience time to catch up to where that series was. And now we're kind of on equal footing. And it's a perfect time for it. So I don't feel like in making this decision, I don't feel like I have sold out. Because I know that I have a series that is in a genre that actually sells really well. Now, I have kind of forgotten about the Fringe Killer series. There was a reason for that. Because I had all of these other genres and books that I had to promote. And I wasn't sure that I was ever going to go back to the Fringe Killer series. Now I have. So I'll start promoting them again. Even better, I have a lot of ideas for this series. In fact, the first one is going to be called Love Bites. I'm really excited about this. Now, I have to warn people that the Fringe Killer series can be kind of brutal. The first book, A Blade Away, is brutal. And it is not so much a procedural drama as it is a crime thriller series about people. That's really the driving force behind this series. It's about people and how they function in society. The very nature of the series. It's called the Fringe Killer series because it centers around people in the fringes of society. So either people in the fringes of society are being killed, or people in the fringes of society are doing the killing. And that, I think that was one of the things that really spoke to me about this series, because I have always been one that lived kind of on the fringes of society. I have been a punk, I have been a goth, I have been all sorts of things that just aren't the norm. I am an artist. That in and of itself places me on the fringes of society. And according to my stepdaughter, she called me the other day a true artist. It was a very touching moment for me and I needed to hear that. But I've lived in that realm, so I know what it feels like to be treated as though that you were on the fringes of society. So that series touches me, and writing these characters is important for me. So when I decide to go back to that series, even though I know it's a genre that sells really well, it's not about selling out. For me, it's about selling back in. And I think that it's important for every artist to evaluate why they do what they do. And it speaks very much to what's called writing to trends, or programming to trends. The thing about trends is that they come and go like that. Take, for instance, when the Twilight series hit. Before that, vampires were there. People loved them still. There were some wonderful vampire movies, but they didn't have the huge appeal like, say, Harry Potter did. And then she wrote Twilight, and the movies were made, and all of a sudden vampires were everywhere. Same thing that The Walking Dead did to zombies. People got sick of vampires, but people were still writing to that trend. And if you as an artist, whether you're a writer, whether you are an artistic director programming a theater season, if you are looking at what you are going to be doing next, and you are evaluating that based on what is trendy right now, know that by the time that that book either releases or that play either opens, those trends could be gone. And people could be over exactly what it is that you thought that they were about at that moment. And the thing is, it's really, unless you have artificial intelligence and machine learning and all of these other algorithms at your disposal, it is really hard to accurately predict what trends will be popular at what time. There are businesses whose sole purpose is to try to do that. And they're not very good at it, because society's love for something is very fickle and it changes on a whim. One minute everybody loves vampires, the next minute everybody loves werewolves, the next minute everybody loves a little BDSM or SMBD or whatever it is, whichever way you want to say it. The next minute they're into thruples. Who knows? That's just it. One second it's all round-toed shoes, the next second it's pointy-toed shoes. You never know what's going to be popular. So when you try to write trends, know that you're already behind the trend. And the trend's going to be gone, and you will have spent all of that time and effort and money and blah, blah, bitty blah into something that's going to be passé. You don't want that. Yes, you can look at genres and say, which genres are popular? Which genres are hot? And you're going to find that there are certain patterns and there are certain constants. Romance, crime thrillers are fairly constant. Within the last 8 years or so, political biographies have been pretty constant. Who knows how long that's going to last? So even when you're looking at genres, know that unless you're looking at specific ones that always remain constant, You could decide to write a genre whose popularity is limited at best. So, to that, I say, write what the universe tells you to write. Write what your heart wants you to write. Write what your soul begs you to write. Because if you do that, you're really going to love what you create. And if you love what you create, the end result will be fantastic. That was a lot to throw at you. But I hope that you've learned something. And if not, I hope that you're excited about me returning to the Fringe Killer series, because I sure as heck am. I've missed those characters and I've missed that world. So here's the deal. I'm going to stick with writing those 3 series with Devil Dog Press, which is the Fear series, the Reaper series, and the Ghost of Brookhaven series. I'm going to rotate those, and I'm going to pick up the Fringe Killer series, and I'm going to write on that again. And I do that because I want to remain a hybrid author. I was thinking about only writing for Devil Dog Press, but there's a little part of me that says, nah, you're a DIY kind of person. Let's also keep that going as well. So, and I might, who knows, I might go back to the Suicide series. I might go back to the Hell's Muse series or the Shiro series. Who knows? But just know that right now, I'm focusing on those 4 series. That's a lot. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of my little world here and listening in on the conversations that me and my muse have. Because sometimes, I don't know, maybe they're important. Maybe they're not. And when they're not important, at least maybe they're entertaining. Either way, you, my friends, are awesome.